Go straight? Okay. All right, I thought that was being an introduction. So welcome, everyone. Thanks for coming. My name's Andrew Jack from the Financial Times. It's a great pleasure to welcome you. There'll be prime time extracts of the video of the Commissioner of the FDA this evening doing yoga. We're here over the next hour to talk about the pharmaceutical industry and innovation. Where's it going in the future? We've got a great panel with very varied perspectives. Margaret Hamburg, the Commissioner of the FDA, Neeraj Mistry, who's Managing Director of the Global Network for Neglected Tropical Diseases at the Aspen Institute, Krishna Yeshwant at the end here, who's a physician and also works with Google Ventures, and of course Freda Lewis-Hall, who's Chief Medical Officer and Senior Vice President at Pfizer. I think we'll start with a discussion over about 30 minutes or so, and then I hope you've also got lots of questions. I know there's some great expertise in the audience as well, so it'd be great to make this an open dialogue. But let's start a little bit just thinking about innovation in the pharma industry, and the spiel for this session was very much about the model being broken. But let me just sort of flip that around a little bit really and ask the panelists how far they really do think innovation in medicine is broken. There was a piece in the New England Journal of Medicine I just saw yesterday, plotting actually graphically new drug approvals since 1938. And although it goes up and down, you can see a fairly consistent and actually slightly rising trend, about 25 to 35 new molecules being approved pretty much every year. Of course, there's plenty of disease areas where we need a lot more, in HIV, in cancer, in many neglected diseases, and so on. But that said, we've got, and we continue to have this year alone, a lot of pretty extraordinary new therapies, for example, for hepatitis C, some really promising breakthroughs in cancer, and so on. So, I mean, maybe we'll start with you, Freda. I mean, what do you think? Do you think the model actually is broken, or is the drug industry continuing to deliver sufficient, productive new medicines?
Well, I think it's both. We certainly have made incredible progress over the last 20 or 30 years in cracking the code on many illnesses and delivering new therapies. And even before then, vaccines have certainly made a tremendous difference in the United States and around the world. We've shown that under duress, polio, HIV, we can come together and really innovate and deliver what we need when we need it. But you've already pointed out the progress is slow and steady. And I think that when we say that it's broken, maybe what we mean is we don't take full advantage of all of the technology and new science that we have available to us. We just haven't been able to fully integrate and deliver all that we believe we should be able to.
Margaret, what's your take on this? Obviously, you're seeing new applications coming through all the time. Do you feel there's a slowdown, or there's a failure, or there's some big challenges that need to be?
Well, I think there's a real shift, and I think it reflects that this is a period of enormous advance in terms of science and technology. And if you look at the new molecular entities, the new drugs that we've approved in recent years, while the numbers, they've gone up a little bit, but it is pretty steady. The kinds of drugs that we're approving now are really exciting breakthrough drugs, much more than maybe in the decade that preceded. We're seeing things like the hepatitis C drug you mentioned that is really a cure. We're seeing first-in-class drugs and seeing drugs that really matter because of gaps in available treatments and other options for patients. So that is exciting. I think what I'm really conscious of, and frankly it scares me a little bit, is that it's not just what we're seeing in terms of new drugs that are really reflecting deeper understandings of the underlying mechanisms of disease, human biology, and human immune response to disease, but we're seeing all kinds of new combination products, drugs and devices that are merged into one. We're seeing mobile medical apps and software-driven devices. We're seeing all kinds of things that we never really even dreamed of, and certainly never prepared for in terms of our legal regulatory framework, et cetera. So it's challenging us, just as I think the science and technology is challenging innovators to do much more.
Neeraj, what's your take?
So rather than say the system's broken, I think I'd say the system's evolving. And to step back from the health industry, if we look at the oil and gas industry, finding new models or sources of energy, or you look at telecommunications, how it's changed, or even media and entertainment, from cable to new applications, I think it's a natural evolution that's happening for the healthcare industry. And there's 2 points, I think, that are important to look at in this evolution. One is the issue of access to new markets. And this is segments of population that weren't traditionally in the business model for industry or even for donors supporting, and I'm talking about the poorest billion people living on less than $1.25 a day, but also transition economies who now have some out-of-pocket resources that they can actually contribute to their healthcare. And then the second point of evolution, I think, is the new technologies that we're seeing, and it's not necessarily IT sort of technology, but I think new sequencing technologies which open up the whole realm of gene therapy, individualized medicine is the next frontier we're going to look at for access to healthcare.
And specifically thinking in the developing world with some of the neglected diseases that you're dealing with, a big deficit in innovation.
Absolutely, and so I think there's 2 points for that. One is that we have many tools that we can use and can have huge impact. So we need to get it out there, because I'm a believer that new tools don't matter if you can't use the tools that you have. But I think good medical or scientific practice is that you always have to have something in the pipeline. Whether it's hypertension, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, or infections, you always have to make sure that there's new tools in the pipeline, because tools will definitely become obsolete over time. And we can't sort of start digging the well when the fire's on. So we have to build that pipeline.
Krishna, let's take your perspective, first of all, as a physician. How do you feel in terms of the pharmacopoeia and what's available to you to treat?
I think as a physician, and many people in the audience can talk to this, there's obviously the great new drugs that are coming out, and hepatitis C is like a great example, all the stuff that's happening around cystic fibrosis and Vertex. I think that's exciting. But more often than not, I feel like I'm seeing a patient where I don't really have anything of real value to offer to them. I feel like, especially in areas like neurodegenerative disease, psychiatric illness, any number of things that we're seeing on the cardiac side. We were talking about sarcoid earlier. These are areas, that's just a smattering of areas. There's lots of things that are happening to patients every day that we don't have anything for right now. And I guess when I think of, is the model working? I guess I think of it in that context, and I think of it in the context of, this broader conversation we're having around paying for healthcare. And, I think there's some part of what we do as a venture fund and as physicians that, look at how you deliver care differently. But at its foundation, the way that I think that we reduce healthcare costs is by curing diseases. And I think that there's so many diseases for which we really have no therapeutics. We only very, kind of basically understand the underlying mechanisms. It feels like we don't have enough investment in the basic science still, and it feels like, I would say that the model seems like it's working as it always has, but the opportunity, to grow it significantly seems like it's been ripe for a while. And so, to me at least, I feel like there's a lot of opportunity there.
Sure, come on.
As you were talking, it made me think about the fact that, it is a complex ecosystem that that underlies our ability to advance biomedical product innovation. And right now, that ecosystem doesn't have all of its incentives aligned so that we're really assuring that the kinds of innovation are really being matched to the needs and the gaps in terms of opportunities for treatment, prevention, and cure, and the burden of disease. And I think that's a real problem, because our system does sort of rely on the marketplace, and the marketplace doesn't necessarily achieve what we, I think, all believe are a set of very important goals.
If you talk about the model, though, I think it has changed a little bit. If I, just kind of think about the things that we're doing together up here, the lung map, the new lung master protocol that is the result of a meta collaboration between the FDA and the NCI and 5 companies on experimental drugs. This is a an incredibly novel design that has a lot of partners and collaborators at the table and has the potential, I think, to shapeshift the way in which we develop compounds for the treatment of complex illnesses. And, you know, if I think about the work on preventable blindness, you know, partnering, you know, literally under the trees in the Amhara region of Ethiopia to provide medicines to people who otherwise wouldn't have them and whose risks of developing a wholly preventable form of blindness, glaucoma, is something we're working on in partnership. And I mean, we could go on and on with the various partnerships that exist between members of the ecosystem in the room, and that's the model that I'm thinking of that is in flux or evolving, to your point.
No, I'll just finish up on that issue, though. I mean, it's obviously sometimes said by the critics of industry that, you know, they've got more incentive to keep providing chronic care over 50 years, as it were, rather than find cures that might, you know, last for 2 months and then be done with. Do you think that's a fair criticism?
No. I mean, I think I have to harken back to a conversation I had with a taxi driver who was dropping me off to work one morning. And, you know, I said, we have 80,000 employees around the world, and the industry itself, hundreds of thousands of people who are employed, who themselves develop diseases, whose loved ones die literally every day. I mean, really? I mean, does someone really think that we would sit on a cure and allow people chronic treatments if we really thought that we could save our parents or our children or our grandchildren? I think the science just hasn't been available to us. You know, I had the opportunity to work several years ago on a treatment that was on the road to a cure for hepatitis C, Vertex's earlier compound. And we were seeking a cure. The science at that moment was not within our grasp, but we certainly had the opportunity over the subsequent years to find ways to evolve a cure collectively. As an industry, learning from each other's work, mistakes, and building on each other's successes. So, I mean, I certainly can understand how people could imagine that because the progress has not been what we'd like for it to be. But it hurts, right? The notion that the intent would be to not bring forward a cure if we had it in our hand.
But obviously, I mean, the science is a big obstacle, but I mean, as Peggy was alluding to earlier, there is a mismatch sometimes, isn't there, between the biggest burdens of disease and where the greatest amount of effort is. You know, we've had a huge crowding into cancer drugs, for example, obviously a very important area, but it's something like 20-25% of total R&D spend by the industry, which isn't reflective of the total disease burden, is it?
But is reflective of where the science has allowed us to proliferate. I mean, the breakthroughs in cancer that came as a result of our focus in understanding the basic biology of the disease and to deploy diagnostics that allow us to differentiate in non-small cell lung cancer or breast cancer the subtle molecular differences between one cancer and another has led us to explode in this area. And we've run full force into it because cancer still takes a tremendous toll. Rare diseases. We just had an opportunity with cystic fibrosis, just as an example. Once we understood the protein folding mechanism that was at the core of this horrific disease, many companies rushed to use our best resources in order to identify an advancement and ultimately a disease-modifying treatment in that space. So some of this is, you know, you go to find a cure where you think you can, and you know, our system continues to work in areas to clarify, to amplify, to give us the scientific ability to rush in.
So I think where we've seen efficient models develop is when people don't work in isolation within their own sector. And I think the models that we have that point to this, and I think they arose from a lot of advocacy or activism and lobbying, is the IAVI model, the International AIDS Vaccine Initiative, which is a collaborative platform. And also for rare neglected diseases, we have these product development partnerships that is funded from public funding or private philanthropic funding. It uses industry's competencies. It brings in the non-profit sector, community-based organizations. And I think we've seen some really nice products emerging, for example, for malaria, with Drugs for Neglected Diseases initiative. And I think there's something worth looking at in those sorts of collaborative models that expand access and have a potential market. It may not be as a high profit margin market, but certainly I think the numbers would be much higher.
Yeah. But at the moment, most of those neglected disease research areas have been funded somewhat philanthropically or through CSR programs of the companies.
Yes, they have, and there's also external donor funding as well as public money coming from bilateral agencies. The US government, for example, has significant investment in these areas.
And there are other ways to partner. If we took, for example, the World Intellectual Property Organization's a program on kind of repurposing, which is a partnership between governments, investigators, interested parties, advocacy groups, and pharmaceutical companies, as well as regulators around the world, that have come together to share a database of information on existing compounds and the information that we know about them. The system is an open system so that you can gain access, if you're an investigator with an idea or interest, to these data sets, and ultimately to the compounds that are provided by the companies who have put this information in. And this is the way of kind of connecting all of the interested parties, right? People who are seeking cures, people who have ideas about how to use current technology to deploy. And these are things that were not available to us even a decade ago. If you were working on something or you had an idea, to actually kind of navigate into, find out if Pfizer had a compound or another company had a compound, or a university was working on something, or a government had a keen interest, or a foundation had some funding. There wasn't a place where all of that came together. So we're building the foundation for some of these novel, important and productive collaborations.
And you asked in the beginning about how the model was changing. And I think one important aspect of the model that we're really trying to build out now is collaboration. I think you're seeing much more coming together of industry, academia, patients and patient groups, and government, including, yes, regulators, to really talk about what needs to be done, what should the research agenda look like, how can we leverage all of our different but coordinated resources. And from our point of view at the FDA, it's very, very exciting, because by us getting involved earlier and really helping shape what are the research needs, what data needs to be collected to really move it from a good idea in science into a real world product, we are really quite convinced, and the data supports it, that we can really speed not just the review time within FDA, but the development time, and take several years off of the time it takes to develop a new product, reduce the costs in doing so, and also by being more innovative and creative about clinical trial designs, we can do smaller, faster studies as well, as long as it's grounded in really good science that gives us the robust answers about safety, efficacy, quality, and performance that we need. So I think that is really exciting.
Yeah, and I mean, I think I agree with all that. To me, like, to some degree, the takeaway is that I think the industry is fundamentally changing, and it feels like it's because the previous model, just can't continue to expand in the way that it has. You can't find any more, big blockbuster drugs that we're going to, release across the industry. A lot of the innovation we're seeing is happening in academia and being partnered directly into pharma or coming out, through startups. And I, at least from our perspective, what we've seen is largely a lot of large pharma groups combining. That feels like consolidation of at least the larger pharma entities, which offers, I think, broadening of the pipelines, broader distribution, but it still requires some fundamental change in how discovery happens. And I think it's exactly as you're saying, like, kind of these sorts of collaborative efforts are, more prevalent. I don't think it's because everybody's wanted to do those for a long time, but I think now we're in a state where everybody has to do them, and that's exciting because everything's changing, and when things change, there's opportunities.
So I think it points to an important point of then what is the research agenda? And in academia, I think it's what's the fancy of the researcher, what's their favorite issue or disease, and
or what's getting funded.
Or what's getting funded. And Tony Fauci talked about how the government is actually looking to industry to say, how do they in government take a product or start the discovery process and then at some point hand over to industry to actually go into manufacturing trials, etc. And I think that's a very important point where we, civil society particularly, can actually chime in on what the research agenda should be and work collaboratively at that level with the government.
I'll come back to partnerships in a minute, but let's just first, before we look at, as it were, solutions, let's just go back one more time to the challenges with the current model, because while we've still had continued innovation and new products coming through, the costs have been just rising constantly, haven't they? More than $1 billion if we believe the industry estimates, including costs of failure and so on. And there's clearly a number of elements to that. But I mean, let's start. Sometimes the industry will attack the regulators and argue, or at least society's expectation reflected in the regulators, in constantly demanding more trials, longer trials, more patients, the safety concerns and so on. Is that a fair critique?
Well, I think we're trying to look at that, in a clear-eyed way and ask whether there are ways that we can streamline and make more efficient the regulatory process. And I think we are doing that, and it certainly is reflected in our review times, et cetera. But I think the fundamental thing is that we are, partly because the science is getting so much better, really able to be more innovative and more flexible about what are the data standards. And really, as I was saying, working with the biomedical research community and with industry to really make sure that the research is being done, the studies that are being done are the studies that need to be done. We don't want, unnecessary data to be collected, and we don't want, certainly, to be asking for studies that are needlessly lengthy, expensive, and delay the opportunity to move products to people. Now, with this shift in model, there is a recognition that we don't always know everything about a product that eventually we would like to know. And part of that is that we see our responsibility as a life cycle approach. It's not just that our job stops if we say yes or no in terms of product review and approval. We continue to do monitoring and post-market surveillance and sometimes require companies to do studies after approval to dig down into certain issues so we can better understand it, to be able to have a system in place to recognize emerging safety issues that may occur, to understand more about real-world experience with these drugs, because it's just a given fact that you have a limited population in the pre-market process that you're studying. Even if it's thousands and thousands, if it's a relatively rare safety event, adverse event, you're not going to always pick up the event and be able to be sure that it exists until many, many more millions of people are taking the drug. So that, I think that's really important, and it gives us an opportunity to take a different approach to regulation, but also begin to move things perhaps a little more swiftly to people that are waiting for them in terms of new treatments.
Where the need is high and there isn't much out there with accelerated or conditional approvals, you're doing more to shift for earlier approval with updated monitoring afterwards.
Right.
And also more personalized or precision medicine allows you to work with smaller populations to speed up your trial, to improve your accrual of patients, and the treatment effect that you are measuring because you have a very focused population. Non-small cell lung cancer is a great example. Recent approval in a compound that focused on 4% essentially of the non-small cell lung cancer population. Once we understood the biology, could identify the marker, then we could amplify the signal in that patient population by recruiting in patients that had those characteristics. Smaller number of patients recruited over a shorter period of time with a larger treatment effect. You anticipate, of course, the experiment ultimately tells you. Cystic fibrosis is another great example. The G551D population, which was originally studied, is about 4 or 5% of the cystic fibrosis population. Again, a very small targeted group of patients that it was believed because of the mechanism of action of the drug, you would see an amplified effect, and therefore smaller numbers of patients over a shorter period of time. So I think that some of the advances that we have scientifically put us in a position to begin to do things faster, less expensively, and with greater effect. It also means that we have to get satisfied with the notion that, that the current model that you're talking about is really the immediate past model. Right, it's not really what we do anymore because the science has allowed us to move forward. Our partnerships with regulators and others has allowed us to do something a little bit different that wasn't as possible, say, a decade ago.
And partnerships also with even other companies and certainly with academics and so on in a way that perhaps didn't historically happen so much within the pharma industry.
And I'm thrilled about some, and I'm sorry because I'm just so excited about what's happening in our arena. But you had mentioned that building an agenda is important, and I think there are some really critical things that have happened. Industry has now not stood there waiting for the academic community to answer some questions, to find some cool things, and to pitch them over the wall at us for development. But instead, there are models that are evolving that actually put experts out of academic institutions together with company scientists to tackle vexing problems. We have 3 such centers, one in Cambridge, one in New York, and one in California in the Bay Area, which essentially takes 7 or 8 university platforms, pulls them together to try and answer critical questions in areas that otherwise we would be waiting for you to discover at one university or you to happen upon, and then us, if we were fortunate, to come upon it in a journal. But instead, we're pulling ourselves together. And the National Institutes of Health established for the first time in decades a Center for Translational Sciences. So that's to close the gap between things that are discovered, early phase discoveries, to kind of bridge that gap into later phase development. And that's where a lot of time got lost for a while, that translational space. And the new National Center for Advancing Translational Sciences is specifically focused on new technologies, new partnership mechanisms, and a whole host of kind of problem solvers and facilitators to make these collaborations work better and to reduce the serendipity around them, actually.
So before we open it up, let's just do one final round looking at some disruptive innovation, if we're going to maybe going to Krishna and thinking about the role in your Google hat, as it were, of data and IT providers in interacting, or perhaps even in the future taking the lead maybe in terms of research and drug innovation.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the stuff that we're seeing right now is opportunities around the data side, pulling large amounts of genomic information together. I think as we, to me, you kind of, I think initially framed like kind of the large amount of interest in cancer is maybe kind of, a failure of the model. To me, I actually see that as a, success in some ways. If you have an area where science is able to like make a nick, then you'll have a rush of capital to try and actually open that up and see what other sorts of things. I think that's totally what we're seeing in cancer. And when I think of other rare disease, other areas, I mean, the story of cancer is really one of, large disease areas like breast cancer becoming actually lots of different disease areas. And I think, it's interesting because it provides this interesting model for how we approach other sort of rare diseases. It's by actually understanding the biology and being able to, provide therapeutics against them. In order to do that at scale, we need data. We need to understand, where are the mutations that are relevant, and really how do you tie those to long-term outcomes of patients. So for us, from an investment standpoint, that's led to investments in things that would lead to larger data platforms. That inevitably requires different groups to interact with each other, and that is often initially uncomfortable. And so you need to figure out ways that actually make sense for each of these groups, to do so. So I think there's lots of opportunities on the data side. Specific examples, that we've invested in would include something like Flatiron Health, which is a company that integrates into oncology EMRs and EMRs across lots of different hospital systems, ingests the data, structures it, and provides ways to look at longitudinal outcomes for cancer patients, and ties that in with any number of the treatments and therapeutics that and diagnostics that come during that process. and we look at other things on the therapeutic side. We've invested in the induced pluripotent stem cell space using novel models to help look at disease areas for which we don't have good animal models, for which we don't have current therapies. So we think that sort of stuff is interesting. But if we were to take an even bigger step back and think about what does like truly disruptive innovation look like in this space, and the sort of stuff that would make me as a physician uncomfortable, me as a venture person looking at therapeutics and diagnostics and medtech in this space, I have to say that there's actually a lot of interesting early stage stuff percolating around, mainly Silicon Valley, and it's the sort of stuff where you look at it and you think, well, how has IT approached other industries? And it's not just the IT, right? IT is just a tool. It's kind of almost a mindset of like, how would you completely upend the industry and reorganize, kind of what the value chain looks like? And, inevitably that sort of thing looks like, the actual value being created not in centralized organizations, but, at the periphery. Right now, a lot of those things that we see, at least from our vantage point, look silly, right? There's a lot of stuff out there that we're not investing in, but we're kind of tracking. And I think it will be transformative to see some of these things start to enter the market. So an example of something that we've brainstormed with other folks, and will sound ridiculous as I describe it, but when you start to parse through how it might actually influence the market, I think starts to look uncomfortable in some ways, maybe in a good way, maybe in bad ways. Is the idea of 3D printing, and we've seen 3D printing of pieces of bone or things that we use for instruments and whatnot. But we've seen a handful of companies trying to 3D print therapeutics. It's I kind of look at that. If I talk to the folks I know at the medical school or at the hospital, I think it sounds silly. But the thing that I start to see when I put my IT hat on is, well, okay, if you have a way to do that, and there's a way for the underlying mechanisms for what's necessary to be part of such a therapeutic, if that could be distributed in the same sorts of ways that other software and music, and it starts to look similar to the way IT has started to enter other industries, and it becomes very difficult to control. I'm not seeing anything right now that seems like it's going to get there in the near term. So we're investing in things that are going to get there. We're investing in the the therapeutics, diagnostics, and the sorts of spaces that we're talking about. But I wouldn't be surprised if sometime in our career, we start to see that sort of stuff evolve, and it becomes, much more uncomfortable as to how this stuff then starts to integrate with, the traditional pharma model, the regulatory path, even the venture model. These things have to change, as those things come about. We're not there today, but those are the sorts of things that we're starting to, see the beginnings of.
I'm just so excited about the opportunities. IT aside, because I think that we are in a position to begin to think about technology and leveraging it. Let me give a good. So one important example in a rare disease, in muscular dystrophy, very challenging to get measurements, especially in a population of these young men who are already wheelchair bound, and we can't get a walk test result, which is kind of the typical way in which we measure their status. And so there are organizations that are working on coding keystroke, power, I guess, and accuracy as a way on an iPad for measuring kind of the integrity of their muscles. And other things that I think have the opportunity that, who would have thought that, measuring range of motion with games and other technology that's friendlier and frankly more precise than the measures that might happen. Technology like the organ on a chip that's being worked through the Cures Acceleration Network at the Wyss Institute at Harvard is amazing, which is to try and find a break, if you would, in the traditional toxicology model, which is often imperfect. So what would happen if I could actually use human cells and a silico platform to look at the effect of a potential drug in terms of safety and effect? So all of these things, I think, are bubbling under the surface. Nanotechnology, delivering diagnostics, smart molecules that can deliver combination therapies on a single molecule. These are all things, Star Wars technologies. Unfortunately, we might be delivering them into the Flintstones healthcare system. And, you know, how are we going to use this fancy stuff, I think, and how are we going to measure it to the satisfaction of a regulator, and how are we going to deploy it, you know, down the street to the clinic, but also, you know, to areas that can only be reached by foot. I mean, there are all kinds of questions I think we have to ask in bringing together this technology that we're on the cusp of using to a system that may not be quite ready to use it. And I think we have some work to do to make sure that it is so.
Okay, let's open it up perhaps. We got some questions. There's one in the middle there, please.
Hi, my name is Dina Bravata, and I'm with Castlight Health, and I have a question for Peggy. And I'm going to ask you a question from your perspective as not a regulator today, but as a public health leader in the past. I spent a lot of time, and so this is a question about specialty pharma. So specialty pharma. So I spent a lot of time with the heads of benefits of both private corporations and then also municipalities and states. Obviously, they're large employers as well. And they talk a lot about this urgency of the medical spend around specialty pharma, and that there aren't very many tools for them. The PBMs aren't really helping. What advice would you, I mean, in some ways it's a public health problem. What advice would you give to these folks who are trying to develop the right kinds of benefit designs and incentives to actually get the right care to folks, but, you know, can do something about these, you know, enormous escalating costs?
Well, if I understand your question correctly, I mean, I think it's hard for me not to answer it, partly wearing the hat of FDA commissioner, because you're really talking about how can we encourage important innovations that, you know, matter in terms of disease burden and gaps in available medical care and public health needs, but have that innovation not break the bank in terms of the products that come out and what the costs are. And I think I'm not very expert at the economics of all of this in terms of what all the contributing factors are and what the levers are, but I think it's something we have to reckon with as a society, and it's something that clearly can be influenced by the reimbursers saying no, you know, saying you've got to bring your price down or we're not going to buy you for our formulary. And there was just an editorial in the New York Times yesterday about, you know, how that's happening, and it has risks and benefits for patients. It may help bring costs down, but it may also mean that important drugs that people feel work for them better than other drugs simply aren't available to them because of choices that a third party has made. I think putting on my hat as FDA commissioner, you know, we have a responsibility to work with the other players in this ecosystem to try to figure out how we can streamline systems and reduce unnecessary regulation and make more efficient the process of product development so that we can bring costs down on the front end. But then I think we have to recognize, it goes back to something we were talking about before, that the incentives in the systems are poorly aligned in some instances, and where they're really critical unmet needs, we have to create ways to move investment into those arenas and to support the market for products that, you know, may not be being sold in developed countries that are willing to pay more but are desperately needed in certain parts of the world, et cetera. So it's complicated. I don't have a simple answer, but I think that it does involve, you know, both really looking at how the ecosystem works and how the different parts influence each other, and then taking some very proactive actions when there are critical needs or when systems are clearly out of whack. But I think, you know, you in your country have some better mechanisms for dealing with some of this because of having a National Health Service and an agency that actually just looks at cost effectiveness, not just you know, risk benefit. But I don't think as a society we are doing it right, but I don't think we know exactly what needs to be done.
Anyone else? Sean?
So I just to add to that, and we're assuming here that the technology is available, it's just quite costly. And having sort of spent a lot of time in Europe, I think the public pay systems, which can create a really, really large risk pool with diversity within it, sort of compensate for those sorts of costs. We have seen in the United States that when a corporation, for example, working on a benefits package, has a large enough workforce with age variation to balance a risk pool, they can negotiate those packages with their insurance companies, but they're usually large companies. And so when I was working in HIV, there were companies that had negotiated domestic partner benefits way before it was sort of policy, just because they had that workforce that was large enough and could influence it in that sort of way.
And we were kind of talking about this earlier. I mean, you know, when you think about cancer as the classic example where there's incredibly expensive therapeutics, you know, as more risk is pushed onto the provider in value-based, you know, payment schemes, I think there's then the question of, you know, can some of that payment be, you know, split? Can some of that risk be split with the pharma entity? And you know, you see it in Europe where you have, you know, success-based payment, or you know, you pay for the drug if you get the response that you're anticipating, you know, for the patient. And I think that sets up at least some of the right incentives so that you have pharma groups that are, you know, only looking to release drugs that they have, you know, a lot of confidence in. And, you know, it wouldn't be surprising, at least as we talk to payers here, you know, I feel like there's increasing desires to do that sort of stuff, especially in high growth areas like cancer where it's not clear how you keep up with the costs.
You know, it's a really important question because right now we've thought about let's just do rare diseases for a second. Rare diseases in aggregate are not rare at all. And as science advances, we are going to be in a position where more and more patients who previously had no treatment opportunities will now have not just symptomatic interventions, but things that are disease modifying. And if I go back to cystic fibrosis, which I think is a great example, the plan for CF intervention started 15 or 20 years ago, and the question was simply this: what would it take to change the lifespan of a child diagnosed with CF from 25 years of age to 50? And then, to your point, you know, the agenda was developed and a disease modifier delivered into the system. So the question is, when that happens for muscular dystrophy and Marfan syndrome, if we come up with something for sickle cell, and the list goes on and on and on, thousands deep, how will we manage that? And so I think we should get our heads around it. At the same time, right now, specialty pharma represents a very small fraction of the cost in any given system. 80% of what's distributed is a generic. And of the kind of rest, 6.6% or so, I wish Yui was up here with the precision statistic. So this is something that, for now, looks like a big issue. It's something that, to Peggy's point, we should begin to think very carefully about, and into the long run, when science delivers important therapies that will be curative or minimally disease modifying.
The interesting question I always think about there is, like, why do we have PBMs? You know, when you have 80%, you know, of the therapy kind of that can be delivered via, you know, generics, you know, what exactly is that part of the, you know, ecosystem doing anymore? But maybe a question for another time.
Good subject. Yeah, what over here?
Thank you. This has been a really, really fascinating talk, and really encouraging as well to hear so many different perspectives about where the field's going. It got me to thinking about something that hasn't really been talked about so far today, and it's maybe kind of a bit of an elephant in the room, which is the whole prescription drug abuse issue. I think that with the number of people that have died, just for example, I think the most high-profile one would probably be opioid abuse, and the numbers of Americans that are dying each year from abuse and the cost, overdoses and the costs of abuse. It has necessarily sort of become a game changer in how we have to approach everything. In the pharmaceutical industry, you want to make people better. You don't want to make them sicker or sick. And so how then, as we as an industry, look toward developing things like treatments for some of those issues that can result, how do we also at the same time philosophically avoid some kind of a conflict of interest where, for example, let's say you had a company that might be making oxycodone, some form of it, who then decided that it was also going to try and make a treatment for the addiction that can result. How do we sort of square that circle in terms of volume driving and things like that in our minds? And I guess my question is sort of, how do you feel about approaching innovations in certain fields when there can be sort of a conflict of interest or ethical issue that comes into play there?
Well, I'm not sure that I'm the best person in terms of how industry views it, but I think, you know, we have to make sure that we are addressing the needs of the public and using the best science to do that. There are people living with acute pain and chronic pain that need prescription opiates, if that's the model that you want to use. Those are powerful drugs, and I think that we need to have those drugs available. We want to try to create products that are as safe as possible, knowing that there is a huge and growing concern around opiate addiction, abuse, and overdose. So, you know, one of the things that we're working on is trying to incentivize industry to create, we talk about abuse deterrence, formulations that will reduce the attractiveness and the ability of these drugs to be used inappropriately. But it's a challenge, and companies are working on it, but there are not any really good abuse deterrent formulations yet. But it's a high priority for us, and we are really pushing industry to work on that. At the same time, we have to recognize that while people need it for pain, we need to make sure that our physician community is using these products correctly, and there's a lot more that can be done with respect to education of providers and patients about appropriate use, and also how you get rid of these drugs if you haven't used all that your physician prescribed, et cetera, because a lot of the abuse comes from people just taking it from medicine cabinets. So we need more education and training around appropriate use and oversight of appropriate use. Then we have a real problem about treating addiction. We have a very fragmented infrastructure for addiction treatment. Again, doctors aren't adequately trained to identify addiction in their patients, and they're not comfortable. They don't often know what to do with those patients and the system for referral. FDA has a responsibility to continue to work on trying to develop better addiction treatments. And then, you know, how do we address overdose and bring products that can save lives acutely, like naloxone, in an overdose setting? You mentioned about the conflict of interest, and I can see why that comes up. I mean, I think it wouldn't be surprising if a company worked both on addiction treatment and the development of pain medications, because you're talking about the same neuropharmacology, the same pathways in the brain, and the kinds of molecules and systems you're developing are going to have overlap. So I don't think that if a company does both, it's because of a mercenary desire to addict people and then treat them. From my perspective, in fact, there's been a much greater and serious concern that people are not interested in, pharmaceutical companies are not interested in going into addiction treatment as an area of investment, because it doesn't pay well, because our system of reimbursement for addiction treatment has been very poor, and it's a somewhat controversial area as well. And so it's an area where I say there's underinvestment, and we need actually to try to encourage industry to do much more in that area, because it's so important overall to public health.
And I just wanted to add, beautifully done. At the front end of that, pain, chronic pain in particular, remains one of the most poorly diagnosed and managed. I see you over here nodding.
Back pain.
Yeah,
Somebody should
right?
do something about that.
So there's a whole spectrum of pain that is debilitating, disabling, impairing, you can name all of them, and life-changing for people who suffer. And we really have a lot of work to do to develop new therapies. First of all, to understand the biology of pain a little bit better, to discern the causes of pain and kind of the underlying foundations of pain, and then to develop new treatments, and then to deploy them to people who understand how to describe their pain to a physician or healthcare worker, and the progress of their pain against that, against treatment. I mean, there's all kinds of stuff at the front end for pain treatment that we have a lot of work to do.
Yeah, that's definitely one of those areas where it's like you're seeing the patient, they say that they have back pain, they've had it for like 6 years or something, and you're like, what do you do with that at some point? And to me, to the extent of, what do you want to see pharma doing? What do you want to see the med device companies doing? Something, more impactful in that. It just seems like a huge opportunity to, prevent.
I just want to answer this from two angles to add to the excellent answers here. One is I feel the doctor-patient interaction is reduced. What's the average time now? 6 minutes, 7 minutes? How much can you learn about someone in 6 or 7 minutes? And so I think the training for doctors to pick up on those screenings or early warning signs is very important. I also think there's a community element to this. If your next door neighbor was acting weird, and I lived in New York for a while, so don't even talk to your next door neighbor. That out. Right? But
I thought they all were.
But if there's a change in behavior, if they become reclusive, if there's mood swings that you notice, that sort of thing, what do we do with that? We don't take collective responsibility for each other. And I think that's where it starts. Just a little anecdote. In our office in Washington, D.C., we now, after these spate of shootings, have these little plugs to put behind our door so no one can come in the office in the event or untoward event of a shooting. And these are the types of precautions that we have to take in the societal context. And what I then did is I said, well, that's one way of dealing with it, but also let's sort of have an education session in the office so that we can pick up if someone has a mental health issue and address it before it gets to that extent. And I think that sort of needs to be extrapolated at a larger societal context.
Okay, thanks. Well, so there's one here, please.
Hi, my name is Al Engelberg. You've all spoken a lot about the need for collaboration across industries and institutions to translate developing ideas into products. I'm curious as to the extent to which existing intellectual property regimes are interfering with that, and if so, what can be done about it?
Freda? Oh, of course. Well, first of all, I think that some of the examples that we gave suggest that we found ways to manage intellectual property and not impair our ability to get treatments to patients who need them. And the WIPO example, I think, is a good one. There's a repurposing platform at the National Institutes of Health that is focused on taking products that have not made it to the market yet, and we've been able to work out kind of a universal IP platform in that space. So I think that there's some really good examples of the current IP platform supporting. Incentives remain really important if you think about pediatric exclusivity and other mechanisms that have been laser focused on bringing new therapies into the hands of unique, special, and underserved populations. That's been a support as well. I think there's still a lot to do with the new, who owns your data? Is there IP around that? Who owns your genetic code? I mean, these are all things that we will continue to have to sort out as technology goes kind of beyond our thinking. But I believe that, not remarkably, but happily, many have come to the table to help solve these kind of in the short term around specific projects, and then in the long term so that we could open up innovation.
And some of the really important collaborations are happening in what we have come to call the pre-competitive space. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't really involve IP, but it does involve you're really establishing some new insights and scientific knowledge or new tools that will be beneficial to companies across a whole product category like identifying and characterizing and validating biomarkers that can then be used to really enable more efficient clinical studies using a surrogate marker or clinical endpoint, helping to design some of those innovative clinical trial models. It doesn't have to involve IP, it has to involve good, solid scientific thinking. A lot of that needs to go on and is going on in terms of big data and data mining strategies as well, and other areas, bioimaging, and you know, there's a whole range of areas where by working together, there's a common ground where companies will benefit, but their IP isn't at risk. But they wouldn't do these studies probably themselves, because if they invested all that time and money and took the attendant risk, then whatever they discovered would probably actually benefit other companies too. So it's a shared investment, a shared risk, and a shared benefit.
Okay, maybe we've got time for just one over there, please.
Quick comment for the commissioner. Well, quick comment and a quick question. First of all, thank you for your work to really increase the ability for patients to interact with the FDA, particularly with your patient network. I think that's applaudable, and I just wanted to say thank you for that. And secondly, how are you using the input from patients and patient advocacy groups to really impact the review process at the FDA?
Well, really an important question, and it's an evolving area, and I think the more we work in this area, the more we'll know and the more effective we will be at using the information. But Freda actually touched on some of it earlier when she was sort of talking, I think it was in answer to your disruptive technologies question, but you know, are we measuring the right things and asking the right questions? And it may be that for years we used certain markers of whether a drug was working or not that weren't actually the relevant measures in terms of what matters for patients and what actually reflects the real world experience of the disease. So that kind of thing is very important, patient-reported outcomes really being integrated into how we collect data, what kind of data we collect and how we assess it. Also in thinking about benefit risk, you know, which is a very key element of what we do, because as we know, no drug is without some risk, and you know, nothing is an absolute 100% success, and so you have to weigh it as you think about how it's going to be used and what kind of difference it will make. And you know, better understanding how the end users, the patients with these disease conditions, actually feel about the benefit risk and what risks they're willing to accept and what they're not is very, very important as we really try to systematize how we think about benefit risk in different kinds of contexts.
Okay, so maybe one question. Just one more at the back there, please. Sorry, who's somebody who hadn't asked? Yep.
Okay, so I don't think we've gotten into the marijuana issue, which is, since we're in Colorado, I think we ought to. Medicinal marijuana is currently a cottage industry. What's the FDA's stance and pharma's stance in developing that for public?
Well, we believe very strongly, and we have for a long time, that more research needs to be done in this area, and we really should determine what works for what conditions. And you know, there are currently a lot of medicinal marijuana uses that don't have a robust database behind them, and you know, particularly when you're talking about conditions that where there might be other therapeutic options, I think it's really important for patients to be able to understand what product, whether it's marijuana or an FDA-approved drug, is going to make the most difference for them and their condition. So I really think more research needs to be done, and I think some of that is underway, but some states are starting to really take up this arena as well, and we're working closely with them. But we need to drive more research to understand this.
So who is doing research now?
Well, you know, some companies are doing research. A number of states are setting up research agendas. and there actually is, and of course the government is supporting some research, and it's a perhaps poorly kept secret, but the government actually runs a marijuana farm in Mississippi, and that it's in an effort to better control the potency of the marijuana for research studies. And so that's a resource for doing some of this research as well. And so I think it's very important, and FDA has a role, obviously, in helping to approve research studies that are being done, and ultimately to review the outcomes of the research. But I think it's a real gap, and I think it's a problem right now, and I do worry about making sure that individuals who are seeking medical therapy, whether it's marijuana or FDA-approved drugs, that they don't have all the information that they need to make the most informed choices.
Freda, not one that Pfizer's going to invest in there.
No, we are not, that I'm aware of, we are not one of the companies who's
So you are doing pain relief.
but we are doing, yeah. So, what I did want to say is, I think that with newer understandings of the basic, the foundations and the biologic bases of disease, that we've reopened the door for researching things that perhaps are on the shelf, that we've developed in our laboratories, or that are natural products, to better understand what it is about them that has a potential effect. So I think this is another area that we're revisiting collectively in research, and that we have some work to do to, figure out how to ensure the potency, and how would you construct the clinical trials, and are the same endpoints the viable endpoints that you would use in other studies. And I mean, there's just all kinds of complexity in reintroducing work in this area. And I think if not in this instance, there will be other instances where we'll need to kind of address this.
Okay. I think there is a full session, isn't there, on marijuana later this evening for those
Yes.
who want to go to the belly up. But anyway, please do thank our panel for a great discussion.